In 1930, the production code was introduced to Hollywood, marking a momentous shift in the content deemed appropriate to grace the American screen. Consequently, the costumes of pre- and post-code Hollywood are drastically different. Why did they change? How did they change? And who got around these changes? In the Roaring Twenties, Hollywood was plagued with scandal on and off the screen. The films studying the years before 1934 were chock full with sexual promiscuity, innuendo, and enough vice to make even the slightest conservatives clutch at their pearls. This was the era that saw films like The Wild Party with Clara Bow, in which a young college girl falls for her uptight professor, or Loose Ankles.
I think you better stay here. I don't think you'll be needing me, miss, from now on.
Starring Loretta Young and Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who attempt to make a scandal at the expense of high society.
Well, we have no time to lose, so we better get back to our compromising position.
Behind the silver screen, things were wilder still in this golden age of moral looseness, and many scandals are often pointed to as necessitating the production code, which would define American cinema for the next 3 decades. First, meet Fatty Arbuckle. Described by historian David K. Frazier as the most famous film comic of the early silent era. In the summer of 1921, Arbuckle was charged for the rape and murder of 25-year-old model Virginia Rapet, for which he was ultimately acquitted. But the news made its way around America, sullying both Arbuckle and Hollywood. It wasn't just the sensational and violent crimes that turned the tide against the American film industry.
Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, affectionately referred to as Douglas and the fiancé of the world.
The marriage of Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. caught the attention of the nation for softer, although similarly impactful reasons. On March 28, 1920, just 3.5 weeks after Pickford had obtained a divorce from her husband, Owen Moore, the biggest stars in Hollywood wed. Pickford and Douglas flaunted that the rules for movie stars were different, that the bounds of conventional marriage could be spurned, and that Hollywood smiled on all of this. Finally, numerous headlines communicating the murder of director William Desmond or the narcotic-induced deaths of the young actors Olive Thomas and Wallace Reed did nothing to help Hollywood's vice image. Fearing retribution and censorship from the U.S. government, the studio systems decided to head off their punishment and create a set of moral codes used to police themselves. Established in 1930 by Postmaster General William Hayes, the original code was made up of 36 different do's and don'ts. But it wasn't until 1934 that punishments were added to the code. So in just a year, from 1933 to 1934, the effects of the production code can be seen. The biggest box office star went from Mae West.
Haven't you ever met a man that can make you happy?
Sure. Lots of times.
Aren't you forgetting that you're married?
I'm doing my best.
To Shirley Temple.
On the good ship, lollipop, it's a sweet trip to a candy shop where
And not pre-code Shirley Temple either. And the style of costumes followed suit. The production code specifies 4 general principles when it comes to costumes, but it doesn't take long to realize all 4 of these principles boil down to one thing: no nudity. The code does get into the finer details as the section continues, but the same overarching message remains. Nude bodies may not appear covered by transparent material, scenes of undressing should be avoided, and dancing costumes can never be cut so as to A. allow movement of the breasts, B. suggest sexuality, and C. suggest nudity. With these limitations, films go from looking like Betty Boop the Flapper to Betty Boop the housewife. Puritanical impulses of the production code didn't stop at mere cartoon starlets. Dancers in films are no longer the loose flappers of the 1920s, but morph into the clean, cheery Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers films, which portray, over and over, the same fantastical, buttoned-up versions of romance. Once the hems had been lowered and the necklines had been lifted, there followed a conversation of who was allowed to embody the suggested nudity and sex, which seems to have been the production code's main issue with Hollywood costumes. One of the trends you see after the code is the emergence of the femme fatale, star of the film noir. The femme fatale is allowed, in her choice of costume, to be more sexually daring because of the fate assigned to her character. Femme fatales are defined by their ability to snare the unwilling leading man into a life of crime. Since this often means their own downfall, as well as that of the heroes, she's an excellent moral vehicle for the Hays Department to demonstrate to audiences the ways in which sexual promiscuity could lead to destruction. In order to signal the connection between transgressive sexual behavior and the fatale's narrative fate, she's allotted this more sensual wardrobe. Hugh Hefner once described this cinematic figure as follows: "Playboy is not interested in the mysterious, difficult woman, the femme fatale who wears elegant underwear with lace, because such women are sad and somehow mentally filthy." You can see here the sensually displayed ankle of Double Indemnity's Phyllis Dietrichson, the fetishistic glove of Gilda in the film of the same name, and the skimpy get-up of Cora in The Postman Always Rings Twice. All of these women are erotically clothed, but given the seedy underbelly of each film, the sexuality is not innocent and thus cannot be fully enjoyed. Not only was the femme fatale a moral lesson approved by the production code, but the appearance of her unapologetic sexuality was a notable fear of the audience who consumed her at the time, and who often blamed women for the distraction they posed in the workplace, and forbid them from wearing sweaters or form-fitting clothing. Gone were the pre-code days of consequenceless sexuality. If an on-screen character was going to read as sexually unruly, she would be slated for the happy ending of a villain. If any producer, actor, or the like wanted to circumvent the production code, there were two clear paths to do so: go through it or go around it. Going through it usually required the muscle of a well-respected or well-financed director or producer. This eventuality can be seen in Alfred Hitchcock's opening scene to Psycho, which discovers two scantily clad lovers in a motel room. In a deftly constructed bluff, Hitchcock volunteered to reshoot the underwear scene when the Hays office criticized the content, but only on the condition that the Hays officials join him on set to give advice. When the censors didn't show up, the sequence stayed.
Oh, you imp, you've got nudity in there.
Well, her breasts were rather large. It was a challenge not to show them.
In a sneakier iteration of this power play, Billy Wilder, whose film Some Like It Hot featured copious cleavage from star Marilyn Monroe and cross-dressing costuming for her male co-stars, had pulled an effective con by first failing to give copies of his script to the Hays office, and then showing the finished product to the press before the censors. By the time the Hays office got their hands on the film, it was a critical success and they were unable to do anything but approve it. The second option, going around the code, was the weapon of choice for the starlets most constricted by the on-screen limitations. There were the Marlene Dietrichs and Katharine Hepburns, whose more masculine dress flirted with sexual ambiguity frowned on by the code, but not explicitly banned. An actress who did manage to evade the clearer restrictions of the code was Jane Mansfield, who who used the press as her weapon and established her sexual star persona through carefully orchestrated publicity stunts. This included walking signed life-size pinups of herself to every establishment in New York City. She was essentially a Marilyn Monroe carbon copy, but her self-promotion led the audience's imagination much farther than her on-screen antics alone would allow for. A favorite trick of Mansfield's was to have her bra straps specially fitted up to pop at just the right time, exposing her breast and ensuring front-page coverage. While no such act would have been allowed on screen at the time, Mansfield was able to plant the seed of a raunchier sexuality in the minds of everyone who watched her more chaste performances on camera.
Oh, those names! How crazy influential!
Eventually, the code began to fall apart as soldiers returned from the Second World War and the horrors of the JFK assassination permeated the nation. It became futile to ban the violence and cruel realities of the world on screen when they were staples of the nightly news. On top of this, racier underground and foreign films were eviscerating Hollywood's market. The production code was eventually thrown over for the current MPAA rankings in 1968. Much of the costume changes between 1930 and 1968 were in response to fashion trends of the time, but the delicate pandering to the code when it came to issues of dress and sex left an indelible mark on the Hollywood psyche.